Another sort of punctuality. There's a book by a contemporary Italian philosopher who's quite much read these days, called Paolo Virano. This one's not translated into English yet. It's called The Memory of the Present. And in this book, Virano is himself wonders. He is borrowing ideas from an early 20th century French philosopher called Henri Bergson. And he appropriates some ideas of Bergson to move towards an idea of déjà vu. Now, déjà vu, we think of that as an ordinary, everyday experience where something happens and it's like, whoa, that's happened before, hasn't it? It's like you're there again at the moment that you're there now. Again, now, at the same time. Virano borrows a particular structure of thought from Bergson, and it is this. And I'm really simplifying, but maybe it helps for this conversation. Virano Bergson say that to perceive something and to remember something are different faculties. It's not that we only, the present is perceived and the past is remembered, but that remembering and perceiving are different faculties that work with images in different sorts of ways. And the logic of that is that remembering and perceiving can be going on at exactly the same time. You follow that logic through, that means one actually does have is having a memory of the present. Well, not just memories of the past, but one has a memory of the present, what one perceives and what one remembers. Virano suggests we tend not to notice or care, maybe, that we have a memory of the present because we don't really need it. The point of the images that come to mind are that they are the images that enable us to act in the world, to do things. They give us the ground upon which we can understand what it is we're doing. They give us the ground upon which we understand the potentiality in our situations and how this potentiality could be made real in particular actions. But actually, in real life, we are remembering and we are perceiving at the same time. Now then, and this is sort of the conclusion. When I think about the theatre performances that I want to go back to, and I want to remember, and I want to talk about, and I want to think about again, for me, they're starting to all frame themselves up as performances in which I'm aware of a certain sort of memory of the present. As if the thing that's happening now is functioning like a certain sort of repetition. It's happening now, and weirdly, it's happening again. Virano makes a particular claim. Where he's really going in this book, called The Memory of the Present, he's trying to think about how do we think historically. He's asking himself, what is a historical consciousness? What is it to be conscious of history? And what is it to be conscious of history happening now, for our own moment, our own present, if you will, to be historical? What does it mean to open historical consciousness up? And I have a suspicion that there's something going on in a whole range of contemporary performance which deliberately puts itself in the framework of theatre, which borrows certain theatrical modes, which refers, let's say, to certain theatrical ways of being, to certain theatrical frameworks, which puts the spectator in a situation of experiencing a certain sort of memory of the present, where, if you will, we're aware of the potential of things and we're aware of the actuality of things and the gaps and the distances and the broken middles in between. But I'm not going to give you any particular examples of this today. What I will finish off with is two thoughts of where this maybe spins off for me. If I ask myself, okay, yeah, Joe, fair enough. You're talking about memory of present, and you're quoting this philosopher who says, through a consciousness of the memory of the present, we become conscious of history. What sort of forms does that consciousness take? What sorts of repetitions are we really talking about? And I suggest two. One would be the repetition of compassion, and the other would be the repetition of abandon. And if you will, go back to my cave painting, maybe as a certain scene of compassion, so is West. I'll go back to the video as well as a certain scene of abandon. I'm often interested in a certain experience of being at the theatre where one experiences a relationship between that figure who comes on stage as the human being, where humanity is redefined historically anew every time there is an appearance, and feeling a certain compassion for that figure who, if you will, is obliged to carry the burden of the image, but a compassion with which I can do nothing. There's a very famous play by Samuel Beckett, which I guess all of us probably know, called Not I, where a mouth is there in the darkness of the stage speaking very, very quickly. And often what people forget when they talk about this show is there's actually another figure on the stage, which is a hooded figure to the side who sort of raises their shoulders. He says, I think, in a sort of a gesture of helpless compassion towards this figure. I'm interested in that, if you will, of a certain sort of model of theatrical economy, which is a sort of compassion which would draw back, which would save, which would remember, which would redeem, which would gather up again, but somehow can't. The bridge between here and there is broken, and its brokenness is the interesting bit. So a certain sort of repetition of compassion. The second, last idea, a certain sort of repetition of abandonment. The figure who has made the image in the cave, on the cave wall, is an image maker who is no longer there. They have already abandoned the scene. The figures who fall over in the Kinkelleri video, it's like during the scene that we look at, they abandon their role, they collapse, and then immediately appear to be abandoned, as it were, by the world in which their performance has taken place, the world which just carries on without them. I kind of sort of want to end it up there, but then if I was going to head off, but I'm not sure I could do this today, the last sort of link in the chain here would be to think about, well, to think about love, actually, and to think about a certain sort of structures of loving and how they relate to theatre. I'll just try, if I can, to find the words to say this. How to say this? Okay, I'll quote from, I'll hijack Wonders again, I'll steal from something. There's a writer, an English writer who died some years ago, a philosopher, who's very, very hard to read, and I've been fascinated by this woman, a woman called Gillian Rose. And I often find myself fascinated by writers and by theatre makers whose work I find too difficult to understand. It's often what draws me to them. Not so that I get to understand them and then I get to appear clever. My fascination stays with the difficulty and the hardness of understanding. And she is writing about a particular book, actually by a 19th century writer, Kierkegaard. But she has this lovely figure at the end, is that it's about some guys trying to put something over on some woman, and then there's some rubbishy 19th century business going on. But she has this idea that the woman in this story basically abandons the story, that she wanders off, that she leaves the book, the story, the scene to itself. You get on with it. And she's been staged there as a figure of the lovable, if you want. And Virno also in this book, The Memory of the Present, talks about the lovable, about the potentiality to be loved, the potentiality to love, and how that could be actualized. And I'm interested about a notion of abandoning the scene, or being abandoned by the scene, and how that actually gives one the space to go into the world and learn how to love on your own accord. Not, if you will, that sort of classic notion of a certain sort of engaged or activist theatre, which is, okay, this is what you're set up to do, spectator, to go into the world and then act. But that a theatre or a book or a structure of thought that abandons the reader, that leaves them on their own, isolated, to organise their own sense of how to love. So I've got those bunch of ideas, that's one version of them, and they swim around and then they get put back in their box. I actually get put in little plastic files on my desk and I come back to them every few months. That's my offering for now.